Greetings, Timon Green here of TLG Information Solutions, which is located in Metro Atlanta, Georgia. And what I'm going to be talking with you about in this tutorial is how to prepare a pivot table. Microsoft Excel is pretty much an in-demand software application, regardless of what field you are entering. So if you're in accounting, finance, even marketing, you can find that your company may ask you to be able to do pivot tables in order to condense data and summarize information. Now, pivot tables in and of itself is not all that difficult to prepare. However, depending on what the person is looking for that asks you to prepare that pivot table, it may take some thought behind how to construct the pivot table in order to give that person the information that's needed. Now, I'm going to be using a simple example of a pivot table, how to create one in Microsoft Office 2016, but the same steps apply in any version of Excel that you use. So it doesn't matter which version, just want you to make sure that you understand the concept of what a pivot table does. Now, the word pivot inside a pivot table means that you can move information anywhere in the spreadsheet that you want it to go. And what the pivot table is going to do is going to condense that information so that it could be summarized and it'll shrink the size of the spreadsheet. Now, like I said in the beginning, the pivot table is a very useful tool once you get the hang of how to do them. So therefore, I'm going to be showing you the simple steps for how to do a pivot table. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, what's presented to you right here is a spreadsheet that I pulled from QuickBooks file. So this is a QuickBooks Online data file. So the layout of the spreadsheet basically consists of columns and rows. So your columns basically contain your information that you're going to be analyzing, and then the rows is just specific details about that information. So what the pivot table is designed to do is you can take any bit of this information that's on the spreadsheet, you can move it anywhere you want to go, and then the outcome should be the data is going to be condensed for you. Now, just to get an idea of how they works, let's take a look at how pivot table works rather. Let's take a look at how this is currently. Now, this company is called Craig's Design and Landscaping Services. And what this table is going to do is I want to look at all of the transactions, and I want to, well, actually, I want to look at all, yes, I want to look at all the transaction types. I want to, for each transaction type, I want to see the name of the company that that transaction type is associated with, and I want the pivot table to tell me what account is involved and also what the total amount is. So in other words, the pivot table, the main column that the pivot table is going to use to capture the data is the transaction type. So if you see all these transaction types, you see that you have bills, you have expenses, and you have checks. So the pivot table's job is to look at this spreadsheet, look at each individual bill, tell me the name of the person that it's associated with, the account, and the amounts. Okay? So instead of having the spreadsheet where you have bills, expenses, then you have another line with bill, another line with bill, it's going to shrink it to where you see all bills with the account and the amount, all of the expenses with the name, the account, and amount, and all of the other things, checks, with the name, the account, and the amount. So the first step in preparing a pivot table is to select whatever data that you're going to be using inside of your pivot table. Now, I've simplified it to include all this information here, even though we're not going to use it all. Is I like to select the columns that I'm going to be using in the data that I'm analyzing. All right, so all of my information that I want to summarize in the pivot table is going to be listed here in column A2 down to, what's that, H40. That contains the information. So you want to select the highlighted data. Then once you select the highlighted data, you want to click on, and under the search tab, you have this option over here for the pivot table. So we're going to select pivot table. Now, when you select the pivot table, this dialog box appears, which is going to inform you that you're going to be creating a pivot table. You have the option of going in and selecting the range of data again. So we already pre-selected that range. So Excel is pretty much going to give us the range that we selected. And if you're going to be using external data sources, for example, if you have a information in Access database, a table that you want to link into the pivot table, you can use the this option is use an external data source. But for now, we're just going to select the pivot table and range. We have our range of information here. So now when we click OK, what appears now is the pivot table with the information. And notice here that we have all of our data that we're going to be, that was on this here that we selected. It's all summarized over here so that you can see that these are the columns. Now, for some, I like to use another view when I'm preparing this because, you know, I learned how to do pivot tables a long time ago, and I've never gotten away with it. So you may know, gotten away from it. So you may know how to use this view. But I always like to use the classic view when I'm doing pivot tables because I like to see the layout of all of the information differently, like that. So the layout that I like to use, the classic view, can show me how to do filter fields, column fields, and drop row fields. Okay, so now that I have the view of what I want, now it's time to take the information, and the outcome of the pivot table is going to be all of this data that was on 44 of this particular tab is going to be summarized here under sheet 2, and then it's going to basically display everything a little bit more condensed. So the first thing that I want to see inside of my pivot table is the transaction type. So over here in my pivot table fields, now there's a couple ways to do this. Okay, you can either filter it down here by filters, rows, columns, and values, or you can just drag it across and place the information there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this transaction type and I'm going to move this down in this box, transaction type, move this down to this box under columns. So you see when you filter it by columns, all of the information comes up here. Now, I don't really like this layout because it's not really going to, I don't want it structured this way. So if you don't like the way how the layout is, you can always move it somewhere else. So we take transaction type and move it down the rows. There we see the transaction types, but now we have it sorted by whatever transaction type it is. Okay. Now, for the columns of the data, I may say that for each bill, I want to look at the person's name. So I might want name that's right next to the transaction type. So I can take name, and I can move it down here right after rows and see all of the names appears. All right, so you have the transaction type, and like I was saying earlier, you see how you have all your bills in the names. You see all of your expenses in the names. You see your checks in the names, your credit card expenses, and all of your regular expenses. So what our pivot table was taking several columns of information and it filtered it out by the transaction type, and it gave us our names. Now, the other thing I said that we wanted to see is what account it belonged to. So we can come over here and grab account and maybe move it down here in the column field. So now what the pivot table should do is list all of our accounts by the person's name. Now, if you don't like this layout and you want to see it a different way, you can, the name pivot in the pivot table means that columns and rows could be moved. So you could just take this column and just move it wherever you want to go. So if you want it to look like this, that's fine too. Okay? And the last thing that we have, once we have the transaction type, the name, and the account, we can simply take the amount field, and the amount field is anything that contains a value, and then we can just move it under values, and look what happened. We have all of our values. Okay, so now notice, if you look at how the pivot table is constructed, there's a subtotal after every name. Now that subtotal don't necessarily have to be there unless you really want it to, but if you wanted to take out all of the subtotals, you can just double click on the subtotal field, which is names, and then when you get the box for subtotals, it's already set for automatic, so you can click none, and that should take away all of your sub. And now with your pivot table, you have a nice, clean, summarized pivot table that has the data on these from this particular spreadsheet summarized, and then you have it by transaction type. Now, if you want to get a little bit more technical, you can actually set up the pivot table to where you can click on the transaction type up here, and the pivot table will give you the associated transaction type with the data. So in other words, if we grab transaction type, we can take it and move it right up here for the drop report fields. And you notice how the pivot table just got smaller. But if you just wanted to look at all of your bills, you can click on the arrow for bills, and that pivot table is just going to give you all the bills. If you wanted to look at all of your cash expenses, the pivot table summarizes and gives you your cash expenses. But the pivot in the pivot table is you can move columns of information anywhere you want to in the spreadsheet, and it's going to condense the amount of data that's contained on the sheet. And that's what a pivot table does. So depending on your job, what type of work to do, you can always play around with pivot tables to get good at it. Okay, so basically I provided you with a simple way of recording pivot tables. Pivot tables, as I displayed, isn't necessarily difficult once you get the hang of it. The hardest part of creating a pivot table could be putting together the pivot table in the manner that the person who asked you to design the pivot table wants you to place it. But overall, if you have information and you want to play around with the pivot table, that's how you learn it. That's how you get good at it. Didn't take me that long to learn pivot tables, but trust me, once you get the hang of it, it becomes a very useful tool. Well, that concludes my tutorial for preparing pivot tables. As you can see, this tutorial is not as lengthy as my QuickBooks tutorials. This one was a little bit more shorter, but the information that I've taught you is going to be very useful. So now you can go and tell individuals that you know how to do pivot tables. So I'm Tyrone Green, Accounting Systems Consultant for my company TLG Information Solutions, located in Metro Atlanta, Georgia. If you have any questions about anything I talked about in this lecture, you can feel free to leave me a comment on my YouTube channel. You can also log on to my website, www.tlginformationsolutions.com, just to see what other services I offer. And if you just have a general question about anything I talked about, feel free to leave me a question on the website. Well, good luck with pivot tables. Hopefully, I was able to show you something useful, and I will be coming back soon with another Microsoft Excel tutorial. Take care.